The new iPhone 16 Pro has some pretty impressive camera specs, and Apple even boasts about how a whole music video was shot in 4K, 120 frames per second using the iPhone. I can definitely see that being possible when you have a studio with perfectly controlled lighting, but is that realistic for shooting in the real world? Well, we're going to take a deep dive looking into the iPhone 16 Pro Max versus the Sony FX3 cinema camera with comparisons in sensor size, pixel counts, slow motion video, lens focal lengths, depth of field, zooms, camera stabilization, bit rates, log profiles, and so much more. So sit back and let's see how well the iPhone 16 Pro Max stacks up against a cinema camera for filmmaking. One of the best upgrades in the recent iPhone is the cinematic mode for video, which mimics a shallow depth of field or blurry background, which is normally achieved by adjusting the aperture on your camera to a wider setting. This is artificially achieved on the iPhone by using some kind of AI wizardry and actually looks quite good in most cases. However, there are some limitations. One such limitation is that when you are focus pulling from one object to another, you can't control how quickly the focus changes. But what is more noticeable is that the iPhone has a slight focal length shift, which is known as lens breathing on normal cameras, when it's shifting focus from the foreground to the background or vice versa. Unlike the smooth focus shifts that you can see from the FX3 with an equivalent focal length lens. With using touch autofocus on both the FX3 and the iPhone, you can see that it's a much smoother transition when looking at the FX3. And although the iPhone has 3 separate lenses, only the middle or 24mm equivalent lens is available for that cinematic mode, as well as only offering 24 and 30 frames per second. So if you're wanting to use the 60 or 120 frames per second for slow motion video, you're going to be stuck with the normal video mode that doesn't have the artificially created depth of field. When you're using an interchangeable lens camera like the FX3, however, you'll get the same depth of field regardless of the frame rate and lens you use, so long as you're using lenses that have a low or wider aperture setting available to get that same depth of field regardless of your focal length. When it comes to frame rates, I don't like using the actual slow motion feature on the iPhone because you're limited to how much you can slow down the footage, and you can only edit where the slow motion starts and ends when you're editing on the iPhone itself. My preferred method is to shoot in 60 or 120 frames per second and slow it down in post to a 24 frame per second timeline. In this 60 frames per second shot, you're able to slow it down up to 2.5 times slower. Granted, you lose out in the depth of field on the iPhone that helps the subject stand out more from the background. When shooting 120 frames per second, you can then slow it down up to 5 times slower on a 24 frame per second timeline. And the footage on the iPhone looks great when you have adequate lighting. However, again, you lose that depth of field that the cinematic mode offers that you'll still get when using a camera like the FX3. When it comes to stabilization, the iPhone outperformed the FX3 in these tests, where I was following quickly behind the subject. The more you slow down the footage, the smoother the footage will look with the stabilization, and it'll look quite stable in 24, 60, and 120 frames per second on the iPhone. When we move over to the FX3, the footage still looked good and is definitely usable, but it definitely looked a bit more shaky than the handheld iPhone footage. However, you have to again keep in mind that you're going to be losing that depth of field, so you need to decide whether you prefer the less shaky footage on the iPhone with the loss of the depth of field that you'd still get when using the FX3, although you may have a little bit more camera shake. With the iPhone 16 Pro and Pro Max, you have 3 lens options from a wide 13mm lens, a 24mm lens, and a 120mm lens. All of these lenses look quite good when you have plenty of light and hold up well in giving good 4K image quality. I don't have a 120mm lens for my FX3, so I maxed out my zoom lens on the FX3 in Full HD and used the APS-C mode that crops in an extra 50% to get a similar field of view as the iPhone. Again, you lose the depth of field in all but the 24mm lens in cinematic mode on the iPhone that you'll still get with the cinema camera. And I keep bringing that up because depth of field is one of those aspects that makes your footage look less video-y and more cinematic and professional. It also looks like the iPhone is losing a bit of detail in the high contrast areas as opposed to the FX3. Here we have another stabilization comparison with some simple handheld panning movements and slower walking where both cameras perform just fine and are quite usable. However, this is one of those shots where the quality of the cinema camera really stands out over the iPhone, and you can tell how much more of that cinematic type quality you get from a camera like the FX3. There's a lot more than just the depth of field that contributes to why the footage looks so good compared to the iPhone, such as things like sensor size, pixel counts, bit rates, and more, which we'll get into in a bit. But first, let's look at a few more features tests. When it comes to zooming in with the iPhone, the camera has to digitally zoom as well as switch from lens to lens when going from the far ends of the focal length spectrum. You can see a shift in the picture when the camera switches from the widest 13mm camera to the 24mm, and then again as it switches from the 24 to the 120mm camera. And in between those image shifts, you're also losing image quality because the camera is digitally zooming with one lens until it reaches the threshold for the next and switches over, and then starts digitally zooming again. But when using a cinema camera with a zoom lens, you can get a smooth zoom throughout the entire zoom range with no shift in the image, as well as the same image quality throughout the zoom range because the entire focal length change is taking place optically rather than digitally. However, the zoom on the FX3 wasn't as consistent as I'd like it to look, considering I was zooming by hand on the actual lens rather than hooking up my zoom wheel that makes the movement much more smooth and consistent. The zoom quality also brings us to the performance and more technical filmmaking moves like the dolly zoom, in which I was actually quite surprised in how well the iPhone performed. Dolly zooms are one of those unique moves that can add an interesting element to a story where the subject remains framed in the same relative space while the camera is either moving backwards while zooming in or forwards while zooming out. If you use the cinematic mode on the iPhone to get the depth of field to make the shot work, you can carefully slide the phone backwards while zooming in or move it forwards while zooming out to achieve the dolly zoom effect. The downside, however, on the iPhone is that you're digitally zooming the entire time, so there is some loss of quality, versus the cinema camera that's using an optical zoom that gives a superior quality throughout the entire camera movement. The iPhone boasts a 48 megapixel camera sensor, which sounds awesome because most people hear higher pixel counts and think that that automatically means the camera's better. However, the FX3 only has a 12 megapixel camera sensor, and we can see from most of these tests so far that the image quality has been far superior to the iPhone footage. And the reason is because more megapixels doesn't automatically mean better image quality. All you need for 4K footage is 12 megapixels, and when you have higher megapixel counts, the camera has to do more processing, whether that's through pixel binning, line skipping, or downsampling, in order to process that 4K image on a sensor that has more than 12 megapixels, which results in loss of quality. The sensor size is also going to play a large role in the quality of the image because it'll affect the size of the pixels as well as how much light they're able to capture. The full frame camera sensor on the FX3 is massive compared to the tiny iPhone 16 Pro and Pro Max sensor, which directly affects the quality of the image, especially in lower lighting conditions. The FX3 looks nice and crisp in this night shot at 24 frames per second, but the iPhone's lack of detail compared to the FX3 is immediately noticeable. And this difference becomes increasingly apparent as you up the frame rate to 60 frames per second, which requires an increase in the shutter speed, which lets in even less light. There's a bit more grain or noise that you can see in the FX3 footage, but it is still perfectly usable. The iPhone footage quality, however, is degrading quickly with what looks like extra motion blur from the iPhone automatically decreasing the shutter speed as she moves into the shadowy area because the camera's trying to get more light in the scene. And what you just saw was also shot in the ProRes log that Apple boasts about, which in my opinion is a bit gimmicky on a phone like this because most people have no clue what that means and just think it's going to provide better footage. Essentially what happens with log footage is that your video is recorded and saved in a washed out, less compressed version than when shooting normally, which allows you more control when you get to editing over settings like exposure, saturation, and sharpness. Otherwise, those settings are basically baked into the footage and much harder to adjust in post without the footage falling apart quickly. However, those settings won't fix things like bad lighting like we have here in this situation. That's why I think promoting how great the phone is by saying it was used to shoot a music video is a bit silly because most people shooting with an iPhone aren't going to have professional quality lighting to make the footage look good when using those highest quality settings, nor will most people have the editing software and knowledge to be able to get the most out of using those settings. I couldn't find listed anywhere online what the bit rates of the various 4K recording modes were on the iPhone, so let me know in the comments if you're aware, but my guess is that they're significantly smaller than the FX3, which has another major effect on your image quality because that affects how much data is being saved. The smaller the bitrate, the smaller the file size, but also the more compressed the video is going to be, and that means more loss loss in quality. Two cameras can both shoot 4K 10-bit 422 video, but have very different results because one is recording at 30 megabits per second while the other is recording at 240 megabits per second. Another limitation is the lack of control over settings like shutter speed and ISO on the iPhone. Like we saw in the low light example, the footage started to look like there was a lot of extra motion blur because of the camera automatically lowering the shutter speed to let in more light, which is something you do not want to do in video because the motion blur needs to stay consistent to have a natural look. On the other end of the spectrum, the iPhone will automatically increase the shutter speed in very bright situations, resulting in more choppy looking footage because that is the only way that it can cut out more light to get the proper exposure. Compared to a cinema camera with an ND filter on the lens, which essentially acts like sunglasses for your lens, you can adjust the exposure with the filters to allow a constant shutter speed for a natural looking motion blur throughout your shot. And when it comes to lenses, you have way more choices of lenses to use with the cinema camera, which allows for many different types of shots that will affect the style of your footage while still retaining the same high quality footage that you won't get when being confined to those three lenses that have the various digital zoom options in between on the iPhone. Granted, you can purchase lenses to connect to your iPhone to get more focal length options, but I've never tested any of those, and I also wonder how well they would work with future versions of iPhone since they're constantly changing the phone, changing the placement of the lenses, and how well that would work when you upgrade your phone in the future. So let me know in the comments if you have any experience with that. But once you get a high quality lens for a cinema camera, you can continue to use it with future camera upgrades that have the same lens mount. The depth of field controlled by the aperture of the lens will also have way more consistent depth of field results than the AI controlled depth of field that you get on the iPhones in cinematic mode. Although I will say that the AI form of artificially creating the depth of field allows you to retain the same ISO on the image because the exposure isn't actually changing, which gives you a consistent image quality throughout the various aperture or depth of field options on the iPhone. Whereas on a cinema camera, you're required to raise the ISO to compensate for less light entering the camera from higher aperture settings like f/16 versus f/2.8. Something else to consider is the time-lapse options. You can record with the time-lapse mode on the iPhone, which is a bit limiting because it automatically sets the speed of the time-lapse after you finish recording. A workaround would be to simply record a normal video for a long time, which also gives you the option to control the depth of field if you do that with the cinematic mode, and then you can speed it up to however fast you want when you're editing afterwards. However, you would end up with way larger file sizes because of the length of those recordings for a time-lapse. A nice feature on cameras like the FX3 is the ability to use interval shooting with pictures so that you can set the frequency at which the pictures are taken, as well as control settings like shutter speed and aperture to your liking. And this allows even more time-lapse possibilities, such as long exposure time lapses that give you a cool look with various levels of motion blur that you wouldn't be able to achieve with an iPhone. And the final thing to consider is that the iPhone is simply a way more convenient camera to use than something like a cinema camera. The iPhone 16 Pro Max is only half a pound and is on you pretty much all the time. The FX3 with my 24 to 70mm G Master lens and mic is about 4 pounds and is not easy to store. I walked 11 miles around Paris and Rome with it in a little shoulder sling, but it does start to weigh on you after a while. Plus, it's not easy to pull it out quickly to get a shot of something, as well as some places may not want you to take what looks like a professional camera out and use it, whereas an iPhone is much more discreet because pretty much everyone has one. The big takeaway is that the iPhone 16 Pro Max is a great camera that has many technological improvements that are closing the gap between smartphones and cinema level cameras, albeit with many limitations that we pointed out in this video. But if you have an iPhone already, don't feel like you need to go out and get an expensive camera before you can start making good quality videos. You can learn a lot with an iPhone for a video device, especially with third-party apps that allow you more control over shutter speed, white balance, focus, and more. But also don't think you're just going to go be able to use it to start making a movie without having high budget lighting and other expensive support equipment. I know I've covered a lot of technical aspects, but I do have videos on pretty much every one of those technical points that I covered, so be sure to check the channel for explanations on those, or leave comments if you have any questions. So if an iPhone is all you have, stop making excuses and get out there and film something. See you soon.